Okay, well, welcome everyone to this inaugural episode of Synth and Cinder. We are watching anime to try and justify it, try and make it not weird. A lot of people in these circles don't like anime, and I can't figure out why. Because maybe they're just watching all the gross, hypersexualized contemporary stuff. But what we have done here is go back to 1983 with one of the oldest, if not the first, OVAs ever released on VHS, Dallos.
I'm glad you brought that up because something you notice quite immediately is that even the supposed child characters, they sound far more mature compared to what we have in contemporary anime. And the themes are far more mature too. It has you thinking along these grander terms and there's these grander themes at play compared to whereas modern anime is more suited towards teens and children. It's more consumer based, it's entertainment based. Whereas these old ones, there's a consumer type of influence to it too. But at least they try to create a story addressing these grander themes that a lot of the Japanese were thinking along at the time, such as they have this boom in industry and technology, and they question, okay, where is it going? Where is this going to lead us?
Yeah, and this one doesn't shy away at all from a lot of those themes. Like a lot of anime nowadays has become escapism, especially with the isekai genre, the another world genre, where characters are in high school or around high school, first job, and then they get transported to a new world where they're super overpowered and the world is at their control, essentially. Whereas this is another world, the moon, but there are almost more problems here on the moon than there are back home on Earth. So we're going to assume that you've seen it and we're not going to run through, or are we? Can you do a summary? I can't really do a summary.
Yes, I can. So basically, you have two different factions. You have the moon people, the moon settlers, and the earthlings. But we don't really ever see the earthlings. And at best, they're represented through two characters, which is Alex, sort of the chief enforcer on the moon who came from the earth to try to keep security up and keep the Lunarians working. And then you have the Lunarians who are there are three different generations. The first generation, which are the original settlers to the moon, and then the second generation, who are born on the moon, and the third generation, which is the newest generation. You see how with each successive generation of these Lunarians, they become less attached to Earth. They feel less attachment to it. And you have this conflict where they're living in this harsh environment on the moon, where there's this authoritarian regime keeping them in line. And it's justified because as we go through the plot, we find out that there were previous colonies on the moon and previous towns that ended in disaster, where entire cities were destroyed due to a small mistake where people didn't follow the rules. So they lived in these harsh conditions in an attempt to keep people alive while they try to extract resources from the moon for the Earthlings. So there's this conflict where the younger generations are asking themselves, why are they going through this? Why are they suffering for the Earthlings? For what reason?
Yeah, because the Earth at this point has for some reason become overpopulated and is scarce of resources. So they obviously send a bunch of people to the moon to mine the moon for whatever it is the moon treasures are. But
Yes.
this is a society of slaves and controllers who are created to sustain that resource scarce Earth. And there are literally everyone born on the moon is affixed with a tracking device that can track them at all times
I wouldn't quite say slaves. I would say serfs are more appropriate in this case
because they
because,
are paid.
well, to be fair, if you study history, slaves do get paid in some instances too. But serfdom makes more sense because, well, that's a separate debate regarding serfdom and slavery. But I'm going to call them serfs because, in my mind, it makes more sense, and I think it's more accurate given what's happened in history. It's more appropriate because it's not like they're going through sort of a slave trade type of thing. It's more like they're kind of citizens of humanity, of this world government, but they're not quite free either. They're clearly under a more authoritarian regime. And you brought up the idea of these headbands that keeps track of them all the time. So it's a fairly technologically advanced society where there is tracking everywhere. There is a surveillance and security state.
Which they need in place because, as you said, there had been failures in the past when they didn't have this sort of control devices in place.
Correct. And part of the namesake of the show, Dallos, is we find out how Dallos is sort of this machine god created by the original settlers who foresaw the coming problems between the Earthlings and the Lunarians.
Do we know that it was the original settlers that built Dallos? Because I thought it was like discovered and nobody knew where it had come from. It was this unknown thing, these ruins of like a ship or a complex or something like that that's still occasionally active, but it's lying dormant on this section of the moon that's largely uncolonized.
No, one of the specials, the compiled specials that they released years later, they go deeper into the plot and they address the situation how Dallas is this machine created by the original scientists of the settlers. And over time, it becomes this myth, this legend, this sort of godlike figure for the settlers as they forget the original stories or the original history. It's funny because Alex, the chief enforcer, he addresses this too in the first episode, how the first settlers built Dallos. And he talks about how they believe it's a god and how just in a few generations, they create their own god.
And that right now we're sitting when this film takes place or this OVA takes place, we are on the third generation, right?
Correct. Because Shun and Rachel, they're about 16, 17 years old. They're teenagers, right about to become adults. So they are the third generation who are reaching adulthood while this chaos, this tension is going on.
And this is largely like the themes you could talk about would be there are these two factions at war, and the story really kind of focuses on Shun and Rachel, who represent the people that are sort of caught in between and how this conflict is affecting them, because they're the rebels and then the Federation, which is the Earth, and everyone's in between. And Shun doesn't really have a dog in the fight early on because this is third generation for him. He's just thinking about, Rachel and tinkering with his toys. He's very talented with robotics, which you need to be being on a moon mining complex.
Shun being quite oblivious, he doesn't even have Rachel on his mind, which is quite funny. But yes, the Rachel and Shun, they are quite naive. It's a sort of a coming of age story where they sort of eat the apple, if you will, and they gain this knowledge about the current world. And they must, as they develop throughout the story, they start taking sides about what the established factions of the moon, how the first generation, these wise elders, they support the resistance movement, but they want to choose a different path of resisting compared to the second generation type of people who, what's his name again? Doug or Dog McCoy.
Dog McCoy.
Yes, as you said, how Shun doesn't have a dog in the fight, but literally he kills a dog, and Dog McCoy comes into the picture within a few seconds. So through Dog, he is the leader of this resistance movement on the moon, and he represents the second generation and their sort of resentment towards the Earthlings and their situation. And then we have Alex, the chief enforcer, who I'm going to guess is sort of a second generation too, around the same age as Dog, but he's an Earthling. And we also have Melinda Hurst, who is the love interest of Alex, who comes and visits him on the moon. But then Melinda gets taken hostage because the Lunarians,
The Moonanites.
yes, the Moonanites, they are trying to resist this. So Dog uses, with his resistance movement, believes that taking Rachel as hostage is a great way to get the Earthlings to the negotiating table. And actually, one of the first lines in this OVA is how Dog talks about they must do this because the Lunarians are allowed to carry weapons. So there is another connection there, how they're being held down, how they're not trusted to take care of themselves. There's no self-government for them.
And that's why I moved towards like, yeah, it's serfs, and you can, yeah, I think you're more right than wrong on the serfs versus slaves thing. But there is some major parallels there with, look, you're here, you were born to work. And it's kind of, you're marked a little bit like cattle. You're meant to do this. My argument winding up in this whole thing is this is where we're headed in society right now. There's this question of equal pay, equal work, raise the minimum wage. And so, yeah, okay, you raise the minimum wage to 50 bucks an hour, and then everybody makes minimum wage, and then everybody keeps working, and then your job is like to work because they keep you controlled, they keep you in sustainable living, the sustainable growth agenda. That's what it's moving towards. It's ultimately going to be two classes, which would be similar to this in that there's the Earthlings and the Moonanites. So they tell you that the Earth is overpopulated and doesn't have enough resources. But since we never see it, we never know if that's true. It could be a utopia occupied by solely the elite.
We actually view this through the Lunarians mainly, how they've never seen Earth, the second and third generation, whereas the first settlers, they did come from Earth. And the reason they left Earth is because of Earth's failing resources, how the Earth could not sustain itself anymore. So they understand the purpose that they're working this hard for. A second, third generation, due to their sacrifices, these three generations, the Earth can finally be self-sustainable and not be in such dire conditions. So now the question is, now Earth is doing all right now. Now, not completely out of the trouble, no, but the Lunarians, they're questioning why they have to work so hard. Why are they suffering still? Why don't they get any benefits from this? Because if they're a united community, then why are they the only ones who are suffering?
Yeah, and why can't they go to Earth? Why can't they go back? Why are they stuck here being tracked? It doesn't add up. So the first generation knew why they were doing it. They had seen Earth and they felt a duty to go and serve for the betterment of Earth. The second generation sees them constantly working, getting nothing, and suffering, and they develop a resentment. And then the third generation, soon or Shun and Rachel's generation sort of just sees it as, oh, that's the way things are. You've got this old generation that dreams of an Earth, the second generation that's not happy, and then we're just living here. This is our life. See, it's similar a little bit to the boomers, Gen X, and the millennials.
Yes, and the first settlers, since they had this attachment to Earth, that's why Dallas comes into being. Because why are the Lunarians suffering so much? It's for Dallas, this machine, this godlike machine that gives them meaning in life, that gives them a purpose for the suffering.
Hmm. So I think one of these things, obviously, this OVA, the story behind it, and you may know a little bit more about this than I do, is that it was made for the burgeoning VHS, VCR market, home video market. And it appears, if you watch the whole thing, spoilers, but we're assuming that you've watched it already, is it sort of ends when it should begin. It looks like a prologue to some bigger story, to some series that would get picked up for TV, which is odd because it never did get picked up.
No, it was originally intended to be an OVA as an original video release, original video animation. But the way it was written, as you talked about, is that it was written like it felt like there was a far larger story being prepared. How it was a setup for a far larger series. It would be like a perfect prologue to something like the Legends of the Galactic Heroes. There are very similar themes there, and it feels that way. How at the end you have Shun, he's joining the Resistance, how Rachel joins the resistance too, how Alex, he's gone through this whole experience and he still kind of wants to fight against the Lunarians, how he wants to gain control over them. Now, Alex is making him sound like this evil authoritarian figure, but he's more like a paladin figure, a very lawful good type of character. He uses heavy-handed means, but he's by no means evil. There are some other characters in the story who are quite evil in their actions. As we find out how the vice consul, along with the security chief, they commit this false flag years prior that gets Shun's brother in trouble, and Shun's brother gets sent to Saturn or Jupiter as punishment. So we don't know if he's still alive either. And Shun's brother, Tatsuya, he was a great friend of Dog McCoy, and they were part of this resistance movement. So we have all these characters set up, and we know their intentions, the conflicts, and we also see Dallos, and this mystery starts getting answered what Dallos is. Because we find out after Dallas gets destroyed initially, it sort of rebuilds itself, and then it turns into this self-defense machine, the self-defense mechanism that tries to keep the peace, and it targets anything that is violent. So whether you're on the resistance side or you're part of Lunarian Security Bureau, or you're part of the Earthling Federation forces, if you try to commit any violence, you get destroyed by Dallos, as we see in the final battle. So all this gets set up to sort of this grander theme, this grander narrative, and never gets answered because it's like, okay, that's the end of the series. 4 episodes, there we go.
It would be great nowadays, as they're desperate for content, to see the continuation now. But I think it's probably a little too close to home for most production companies and distributors.
Yes, well, I don't think people will be able to. Maybe they would be able to make this again, but I think the mistake that they would make if they try to remake this series is to make it too relevant to current times. Because I find that It's either you can mask your opinions, the sort of things you want people to open their eyes to. Either you can do it quite well, like I believe Christopher Nolan does that quite well with his movies, compared to something that's more ham-fisted, where it's like, okay, this character represents all the greatest feminist hero ever. It's going to fight all these evil white males and the patriarchy. But okay, that's way too on the nose. It's too in your face. There's no finesse to explain the story.
Well, and that's part of the reason I like science fiction so much is it's easy to get distracted, which is a good thing in this regard, or to focus on sort of the technology and the environment, the artistic stuff, the visual stuff, and then subconsciously, because it took me a few times to watch through it to say, hey, well, this is a film about technocracy. Like this is the environment that they're trying to create now, where one half of the population works and the other half of the population controls. They make sure everybody's eating what they're supposed to and not producing more emissions that they can offset. It's the whole idea behind carbon credits. Like, I don't really get how it makes sense because how is giving money to the government supposed to offset carbon emissions?
It's sort of like giving your weapons to government. It's all about control. If they have control of any resource, then they can dictate what you can do. For example, the police vehicles, the enforcement vehicles that we see in this show, they're called debuggers. And you debug a virus, you debug an infestation. So it implies that the Lunarians are, in a sense, seen as this infestation, something that needs to be taken control of. And if needs be, something that needs to be exterminated.
Well, and that moves too, is we use this kind of as a joke, the Bug Man of modernity, but it is correct. We don't know exactly what their ultimate idea or definition of new man is, but right now it's kind of like cockroaches, scurry around in the dark, eat when you can, and that's it. Live and eat. And if you get to be too many, we'll squish you.
And it's even worse than that and with entertainment, how if you showed something like this today, how many people will actually dive deep into it and explore these themes that are implicit within the show, even though if the creators aren't aware of the full implications of the themes they're using. Because today it's all entertainment, it's all very cheap.
Right. It's all escapism.
Yes, it's all very like it's junk food entertainment. That's what it is.
Yeah, and that was something that it was interesting with a lot of this earlier stuff, 80s and even a bit into the early 90s anime. They did create these projects that made you ask questions. It did create this entertainment. And I think it was probably somewhat global, but now it's more pacification. A lot of these animes are about fantasies and harems, and everything's all right to a certain extent. And there's definitely conflict, but it's not the kind of conflict you think. It's like, okay, well, how do we go find the right spell to beat this overtly evil character?
It's all an expression of powerlessness, a desire for power in a crazy world of modern world.
They give you that power with a fantasy. Whereas in something like Dallos, these guys start without power, struggle for power, not get power, and then have to make a decision about the next move in an attempt to get power, which it isn't even really power, it's the power of freedom. It's removing an oppressive power in the beginning.
It's more realistic and the way to go about things compared to something like, oh, if I level up in this fake fantasy world, I can do anything I want. If only was transported to this other perfect world, even if it's not a perfect world, as long as I have power, I can finally be free to really do what I want instead of being trapped as this NEET or this office worker or some loner loser. Instead, if I was just given a little bit of power, I can become a king, I can become a god in a new world. That's a great divergence from the original, sort of these original artists in Japan, because they used art as an expression of what they saw as the problems, which was sort of the effects of World War II, of the nuclear bombs, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and all of these coming problems of society, of industrialization, of capitalism, of these long working hours, of this new technology, of these new electronics, of competing with the West, of competing against the United States as an equal partner. Now it's okay, we're a developed nation. We have all these goods, but these material benefits didn't give what we thought was going to give. Instead of getting these mechanized robots, these mecha suits, we need to escape all of this. We need to escape this dystopian bug man society and go to a different world where we can have everything. It's like, oh, I can't have all these women in real life. So what do? I can have a harem in this other world. Oh, I'm a gamer. I don't engage in the real world. But if I can apply these gaming skills to a different world, a different fantasy world, then I'll be the Ubermensch. I'll be the super powerful one.
Oh yeah, I didn't even think of that, an additional layer to that power fantasy of this generation of unmarried Japanese adults that sort of live to play video games.
And you can see it reflects in entertainment, how we had talked about earlier, how it's all childlike. It's all Arrested Development like. They're constantly in this adolescent phase where they don't grow up. They could never become a Doug McCoy. They could never succeed in resisting this authoritarian government, right? They can never do that. Instead, it's like, oh, we're defeated anyways. We don't have the power, we don't have the energy, we don't have the will to do that. But if you could just break me free from this oppression, then I can become king. But that's all a fantasy.
Oh yeah, that's all a strong fantasy. And again, that's why I think something like Dallos wouldn't go today is because it wakes you up to a world that you're already living in, which is this control society.
People don't want to wake up from a dream, even though it's a fake dream. They don't want to leave the matrix. It's too much for them.
Yeah, and that's why we find ourselves firmly in the third generation, which is unwittingly compliant with this control society. And I don't know if it generally works to say that the second generation is like Generation X, because they're pretty compliant now too. I'm not really seeing any real, I don't know where the real rebellion is nowadays. I mean, there are protests and stuff going on, but we've not yet reached the Dog McCoy stage.
There isn't even a real rebellion. It's all astroturf. It's all fake rebellions. They're control rebellions that further reinforces the regime.
Yeah, and it's just a matter of time before we get a Bartholomew event. And it's also important to point out that I think it's either episode 3 or episode 4, there was a bombing that took place, an additional false flag. They did a 9/11. You can't.
Yes, it's funny because there were multiple false flags in this show. The first one we don't see is Bartholomew. It's happened in the past, prior to the start of the story, and that was the one that got Shun's brother sort of excommunicated away.
It was the bombing of a police train, right?
It was civilian train actually. It was
Oh,
blamed
wow.
upon the resistance to try to destroy the resistance movement. And then we have another bombing by, we assume it's the vice consul and the security chief who tried to, I believe, tried to kill Rachel in the process to try to garner support for the Earthlings back at home against the
Wait,
Lunarians.
are they trying to kill Rachel or they're trying to kill Melinda?
Oh no,
Yeah,
Melinda,
because
not Rachel.
Melinda's father actually is a high-ranking Earth official
Yeah, so
who's gonna run for like, yep.
he's running for president or something along the nature of that on Earth, as you find out at the end of the story. And his whole spiel at the end of the story is how they're going to make sure the Lunarians learn that who's actually in control. So we assume that the war is going to ramp up further. And the third false flag event we see that was attempted by the vice consul and the security chief is an attempt to kill Alex, the chief enforcer of the Lunarians. Well, the chief enforcer, the sort of paladin-like figure. So even though he's the one trying to gain control of the situation through these authoritarian means, it's not good enough for them. The vice consul is sort of trying to stir up even more chaos to give Melinda's father a justification for further encroachment, further power against the Lunarians.
Hmm. So it's difficult to then see why Shin remains such a fence sitter. Or again, is centrism the true enemy here? Because near as it goes on, he's rescued. He was in the right place at the right time. He's rescued by the resistance because they put him in jail on some trumped up charges. Then he gets rescued and he sort of falls in out of convenience with this resistance, and some of his robotics innovations are then applied to the resistance, giving them the closest thing they have to an upper hand against the security forces. He sort of finds himself unwittingly doing battle as a means of survival. And he doesn't even really pick a side when his mother is killed in that bombing that we mentioned that was supposed to kill Melinda. He still doesn't even take a side where Rachel's family is then killed and she's whole hog a rebel now. He's still holding off and saying, well, talk to your doctor. You got to make sure you don't, let's not jump to conclusions here.
Shun is almost a stand-in for the audience, how he's trying to understand the Earthling position too through Melinda, or as I like to call her, Ann Coulter. But as we see, he is sort of a curious type of figure and he tries to gain understanding of the situation. But at the end of the story, he chooses to join the resistance, but he says that he doesn't quite understand what's going on. So he's quite this oblivious figure who he's quite in a way naive and honest, but can't really blame him for that for being a sort of like teenage kid, you know?
Yeah, he's 16. Was there ever a point in time you found Ann Coulter attractive?
No.
Really? Not even when she was at her most, disagreeable?
Nope. It
Like,
must be a generational difference, you know?
I
First,
I
second
don't
generation, third
I don't
generation.
okay. Well, she's, a lot older than me, and I found her attractive, especially when she's being disagreeable.
Let's talk about the technology in the story because the sort of technology was made for mainly marketing, mainly for creating toys. There are quite a few cool things. We mentioned the debuggers. There's also it's sort of these mechanical moon mining machines, these mechanical suits, mechanized suits that get modulated to become these weapons. There's also the moon dogs, which are literally cyborg dogs.
I love the Moondogs. I made a point to write down Moondogs because there's a point in it where they can hear them running down one of the pipelines, and they shout Moondogs as if everyone's gonna know what those are.
Yeah, it's like immediately, like it's the first time they appear and they all already know.
They know about the Moondogs, which, like you said, are just cybernetic dogs. I think they might even be regular dogs who are wearing cybernetic armor.
They were regular dogs. And in fact, Alex's dog name was Geronimo. He was a regular dog, probably one of the best dogs, but he turns him into a cyborg dog.
And that works for his character because it shows you just how far Alex is willing to go because he loves this dog, Geronimo, but he's still willing to turn him into a moondog when order requires it.
Yes, he has strong belief in his principles. Like even though Melinda is a hostage, he's unwilling to bend on his principles despite the danger to her.
And there's something to be admired in that. And that's probably how he got the job. It's a guy like him, like earlier you called him lawful good. Lawful good would be a very difficult enemy to go up against unless you had the moral high ground, which you could make an argument that the resistance does, but their tactics are not moral. So if they could get them to believe, and Alex knew Bartholomew was a false flag, didn't he?
He suspects it because I saw on a couple rewatchings, you do get a sense it's sort of very slightly hinted at that Alex and the general console, and there's this other console character too, how they sort of suspect that the vice console are behind some of these false flag attacks. And you also see how Alex and the general console they ordered the Federation troops to the moon without letting the vice console or the security chief knowing that.
Yeah. So within institutions, there are different power dynamics, and that's like, oh yeah, Captain Obvious. But that does make Alex's character a little more sympathetic.
Yes, I also like how the characters in here are quite well read and they're quite human. It's not the simple, like everyone's good, everyone's bad, or if they are good or bad, it's not these simple conflicts. They're far more complicated and they do make mistakes too, which makes them sympathetic as people that you can actually recognize. They're not just these simple characters that, whereas like, oh, I can hate this guy because he's all evil or he's all good.
Yeah, and that's an issue that I have with modern entertainment too, which I find interesting to observe in this is yeah, they are cartoons, but their characters are a lot more three-dimensional than a lot of the actual flesh and blood characters that exist in entertainment today.
Yes, even Alex, he once he finds out that Shun sort of joins the resistance, he tries to get more information through Rachel about why is this happening? What do the moon people want? Why are they so resistant? He tries to understand their motivations, but it's quite different from, let's say, the security chief. There's this one scene where you see him crack his knuckles, right? And you notice that his knuckles are pink. And as he's cracking his knuckles, he's saying how he'll get the Lunarians to comply, to join the organization. And it's implied that he sort of is torturing them to get them to comply.
Do you think the lifestyle that's being arranged to those that choose to remain unvaccinated is a type of torture?
Depends on how you define torture. I would say it's more of a way to liberal types, they tend to go a very roundabout way regarding using power. They don't like using force in an in your face type of way. They would never themselves go and beat you up to try to get you to comply. Instead, they'll offshore that job to somebody else. And that would usually be the police forces. But in general, they prefer to do it in a behind your back type of way where they won't starve you. They won't say that they're starving you, but they'll get rid of your bank account. They'll get rid of your job. So you can't feed your family and you have no way of having money. So although they're not killing you, they won't be pulling the trigger and putting you against the wall. They won't do that. They'll let you starve to death on the outside slowly. And they'll say, "Oh, you deserve that. That's what you get. Those are the consequences." Like even like you can't say we're killing you. You're just suffering from the consequences of your actions.
I see. So what we assume is coming to the moon when the federal troops are being sent will be sold as the Lunarians brought this upon themselves.
Yes, and you see it in the sort of propaganda being pushed out regarding the unvaccinated. It's always this revenge porn type of thing, or this type of thing where it's the perfect enemy against the vaccinated. And this religious type of person who never got vaccinated, who always was resistant. What happened? Oh, they died. See, that's what you get. That's what happens. See, we don't need to look at the facts and figures. It's always, if you don't do X, then Y happened to you, and you deserve it.
So I got a big sort of overarching question that could probably be our finish. Why are we talking about Dallos?
We touched upon this in a previous conversation about how fiction can have a lot of truth in it, even though it might not be factually true. On a grander narrative level, it is true. Oftentimes, you have a good story, a good fiction, a good myth. It will become true throughout history as you live life. You will be able to see the story play out in front of your eyes. And I believe Dallos is one of these things that is true on a grander level.
Yeah, it is eerily prescient. Even within the last, like, we've had this idea to watch this, and we have watched it within, like, has it been 6 months?
Maybe, I think shorter, but I've watched this show 4 or 5 times now,
Yeah, yeah.
maybe
So
6 times.
even in so we'll just say even in the past like 4 months, it has become more and more relevant every time we watched it. And that we had this idea, let's say 4 months ago. I'm like, oh, we're gonna do this. And we kept rescheduling it and then rewatching it. And it just got more and more true.
And you can tell that something is a good story if on each rewatching, you get something new from it. You start seeing other perspectives too that you didn't see in the beginning.
Yeah, and if you can get over some of the technical aspects, like the like the voice acting and the music and stuff like that, it is very dated, but that's part of the charm, in my opinion.
Yes, it is for a very 80s type of, animation type thing. You hear some sound effects, they're like, "Wait, wasn't that in Dragon Ball Z?"
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
something
They
like
were
that.
they were all pulling from, like, a very small library in that era, which is fine, but but yes, just to reiterate your point really quick is finding truth in fiction, and this has been my argument ever since I started doing fiction stuff, is that you oftentimes find more truth in fiction because a lot of times nonfiction can be skewed or nonfiction can be misremembered or obfuscated depending on how clever a psychologist or gaslighter the person holding that belief is. But fiction sort of speaks to a different part of the brain, to the imagination. And there are parts of the imagination you can't lie to because it will know that it's not true or it will know that it is true.
Yes, revisionist history and propaganda are less true than a good story. Oftentimes, you'll find how people, they're super aggressive, they're super defensive about position, about real politics, about real history, about the real world. But if you can get them to sort of get their minds to think about a fake fantasy world, then they can start thinking about these problems more clearly because they're not heavily involved in these emotional type positions that they're entrenched in. Instead, they get transported to a different world where they can think about these situations more clearly with more objectivity. And it's like, oh, wait, that's so true. You see these stories, even though it's a fake world, we see the same patterns occurring in the real world.
Yeah, their ideological biases sort of get lumped into the same process of their suspension of disbelief. Like it's easier then to speak to them on a more human level without all that ideology interrupting. Because if you send somebody a Jay Dyer video about technocracy or a Dinesh D'Souza video about technocracy, they're immediately going to reject it. If you send them a movie, an entertainment piece about technocracy, they're more likely to watch it. And then on a subconscious level, maybe start to identify with some of the themes that you're pointing out.
Yes, and also when you start watching good art, when you start watching good entertainment, or more accurately, good stories, you can start picking out what's a bad story, what's clearly propaganda, what's being used to influence your mind, compared to something that's reaching towards truth, reaching something deeper, trying to understand what humanity is, what the situation is, compared to a ham-fisted type of marketing or propaganda piece.
You got anything else?
Thank you very much for listening. And if you are interested in anime, through us, you can get better recommendations that are worth your time. Because honestly, most of them are shits too.
Yeah. Most of them are actually degenerate. So we do agree with that to a certain extent, but also we were watching anime long before we were getting involved with politics.
Yes, generally they're just cartoons. There are good stories out there, and there's a larger cross-cultural conversation between Japan and the American sort of entertainment industry. And we see this pattern happen with westerns and cartoons later on. How there is this sort of back and forth between same stories, and how each one of them take the story differently. How each one play with the same type of narrative in their own particular manner.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to wrap it up. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we watch Dallos and hopefully more things like it. We're going to attempt to bring you a wide selection of specifically degenerate Chinese cartoons that Synthesist and I will be watching, and we hope you'll tune in. Please join us on IronAgeArchive.com to engage in the conversation.